No worries, thanks very much. Hopefully, colleagues, you can all hear me fine, and we won't have any further technical glitches this evening. Can I firstly welcome you all? Good evening. Welcome to the third in a series of webinars that the STUC are putting on around the future of our economy. My name's Lillian Mason. I'm the convener for Unison Scotland. I'm also a health worker and I'm employed within NHS Lanarkshire. I'm also a member of the STUC General Council, and I want to talk to you a little bit about the STUC in terms of our representation across Scotland. We represent 40 trade unions, 20 trades councils and 540,000 trade union members across Scotland. As most of you know, the STUC policy is democratically decided through decisions made at our annual Congress, but we also are heavily and fully engaged in the current discussions and debates around the economy. So coronavirus has highlighted the problems within our economy, and I'm sure most of you will agree, like never before, this has perhaps been the most stark realisation of when things go wrong, where the public sector and third sector need help, then it's the state that picks up those pieces. The private companies would walk away, and it's the state that's left to pick up the pieces around those areas. That is why we think it's important that we bring together leading academics, economists, think tank, policymakers and practitioners, along with trade unions and activists, to look at the topic that we're going to discuss the evening around public and democratic ownership. I'm delighted that we're joined by some fantastic speakers this evening. And let me just start by introducing the speakers that you have this evening. We've got Thomas Hanna. Thomas is is the director of the Democracy Collaborative, a US-based think tank who have been at the forefront of thinking and working on this topic for a number of years. Thomas also has written a number of books on public ownership in the United States. We're also joined by Sian Moore, who's a professor in employment relations and the human resource management at the University of Greenwich and director of Public Services International Research Unit, PSIRU. Has also been at the forefront of making the case for public ownership across a range of areas, including an area which is close to my heart, and that's around our social care system. Previously, Sian worked in local government and was a trade union member in Nalgo. Our colleague Vera, I'm sorry, I'm going to introduce Vera. I'm going to get your second name wrong. Is it Wagner? Is a research fellow at the PSIRU at the University of Greenwich. She has written widely about public services and is the chair of the University of Greenwich's branch of IWGB Union. And again, we're also joined by Mathew Lawrence, as the founding director of the Commonwealth, a new UK-based think tank designing ownership models and democratic economy. Prior to founding the Commonwealth, Mathew was a senior research fellow at IPPR, where he co-authored proposals of inclusion ownership funds subsequently adopted by the former Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell. He is again written widely about the issues of digital rights and digital infrastructure. So the format for this evening is that we will ask each of the speakers to take around 5 minutes to do their presentations, and that will leave enough time for some questions. We want to leave around 30 minutes for those questions and answers. This evening we aim to finish around 7:15, and I would ask colleagues, if they do have any questions, then there's a facility for you to put your questions in the Q&A chat box. And as your chair, I'll do my best to address those to the panellists. I also want to publicise the event itself. So if you could and you're able to use the hashtag for the event, so please feel free to send out tweets, put it on your Facebook using the hashtag rebuilding our economy. And finally, I should say that this session is also being recorded and it will be available in the coming days online, so you should know that. Let me introduce our first speaker for this evening, and can I ask Thomas Hanna to start off the speakers for this evening. Thomas.
Great, thank you very much. It's a real honor to speak with you all today. As Lian mentioned, my name is Thomas Hanna. I'm the research director at the Democracy Collaborative, and I'm currently based in the United States. Some of you may have heard from some of my colleagues in past webinars about some of the things that we do as an organization, but briefly, we're an action-oriented think tank looking at different intervention points to create a more equitable, democratic, and ecologically sustainable system beyond corporate capitalism. And increasingly in recent years, and I think especially since the financial crisis 10 years ago, one of those intervention points has been public ownership. So first and foremost, when I talk about public ownership, I'm referring to enterprises and services that are technically owned by all people within a given geographic area, usually through representative government at various levels. And I find this definition useful because it allows us to compare and contrast public ownership, not only with private for-profit forms of ownership, but also with other more democratic forms such as cooperatives, employee ownership, and social enterprise. And I think, while I think these other forms are critically important in various sectors, nonetheless, they are still forms where ownership is held by some subset of the general population. So why is public ownership important? For me, the most important thing about public ownership is that it is inherently a flexible ownership form. It can be used to address a wide variety of social, economic, and ecological concerns. It can be tasked with different goals, objectives, and ways to measure progress and performance beyond simple profit and economic growth. And it can be structured in different ways that allow for more or less accountability, transparency, or democratic participation. A couple of years ago, I wrote a book on public ownership, and in it, I laid out some of the proven benefits of public ownership across a variety of sectors. So I'm just going to briefly run through some of those, and then I'll get to this question of democracy. First, economic factors. Traditionally, public ownership has been used throughout the world to deal with issues of market failure, where private companies and markets cannot deliver goods and services effectively or affordably. And contrary to the dominant narrative that emerged during the neoliberal period, public ownership is actually not inherently less efficient at providing these goods and services than the private sector. In the book that I wrote, I reviewed dozens of academic studies across various economic sectors, countries, time periods. What I found is there was actually no consensus on this point about comparative efficiency in this theoretical or empirical literature. Another economic factor, and I think one that's proving particularly relevant now with the COVID-19 pandemic, is the role that public ownership can play in planning for economic, social, and environmental resilience. This is going to become ever more important as we confront the looming threat of climate change over the next years and decades. Public ownership is also one of the go-to strategies now whenever there's a large economic crisis, as we've seen twice in the past 10 years at this point. In our modern financialized economic system, speculation and profiteering is privatized while risk and losses are socialized. So for me, that alone is a pretty compelling economic argument in favor of a return to public ownership. So instead of allowing private corporations and elite shareholders to reap and extract immense profits when times are good, only to bail them out and temporarily nationalize them when times are bad, we should start to think about long-term public ownership, especially in sectors that simply cannot operate for very long without explicit or implicit public support. The second is inequality. Public ownership can and does around the world serve as a powerful vehicle to distribute wealth and income more equitably. Often public enterprises offer goods and services at lower costs. They can return revenues to public balance sheets and cross-subsidize other social services. They often have better pay and benefits, more secure working conditions, and significantly lower pay ratios between highest and lowest paid employees. And at least in the United States, public enterprises have higher representations of people of color and women than the private sector. In the book, I also looked at how public ownership can be beneficial with regards to automation, innovation, R&D, and the environment. I won't get into those here, but I'm happy to touch on some of those areas later on in the discussion if we want to go there. So I'm going to conclude now with this question of democracy. Public ownership is important to democracy, both in terms of reducing the influence of elite individual and corporate interests in the political system, but also asserting greater democratic control over economic decision-making. And while there's clearly a desire and a growing movement around the world for a return to public ownership in various sectors, simply recreating some of the traditional top-down managerial forms of public ownership that dominated in the past is insufficient in my perspective. I believe, as do I think many others working in this field, that public ownership must be re-embedded in active democratic practice and reconciled with the rights of individuals, workers, and communities to fully and freely participate in the economy and control the fruits of their labor. For me, there are at least 4 reasons why public ownership should be democratized. First, involving workers, the public, and other stakeholders in economic decision-making has societal, economic, and individual benefits. Second, democratic participation can enhance the effectiveness of publicly owned enterprises by tapping into grassroots forms of knowledge from the direct experience of employees and users of public goods and services, which in turn builds a constituency of support that can strengthen the long-term resiliency of public ownership. Third, economic democracy generally, and specifically the active exercising of individual worker and community ownership rights, is a critical cornerstone and prerequisite of genuine political democracy. And fourth, democratization reverses the disempowering process of privatization and instead empowers groups and individuals that have traditionally been excluded. I'd be more than happy to talk about what that means in practice and some of the really, really interesting real world examples of democratization later in the conversation, again, if we want to do that. But for now, I'm just going to leave now my presentation with a quote from E.F. Schumacher, who some people might remember as being both the author of the book Small is Beautiful and also the chief economic advisor to the National Coal Board. Schumacher said that private ownership of the means of production is severely limited in its freedom of choice objectives because it is compelled to be profit-seeking and tends to take a narrow and selfish view of things. Public ownership, on the other hand, gives complete freedom in the choice of objectives and can therefore be used for any purpose that may be chosen. While private ownership is an instrument that by itself largely determines the ends for which it can be employed, public ownership is an instrument, the ends of which are undetermined and need to be consciously chosen. So thank you all very much. I'm really, really looking forward to the rest of this discussion.
Thanks very much, Thomas. That was really interesting. We've got a couple of questions coming in, but I'll take the questions at the end. So helpful colleagues, if you could, when you're submitting your questions, just let me know who you want me to ask the questions to. If you want general questions, then that's absolutely fine as well. We can pick those up. Can I ask Sian Moore if you would do your presentation now, Sian, if that's okay?
Yeah, okay. I'm going to use some slides, if I can find them. Yeah. And I think I've got probably too much, but so I'll have to gloss over some of them. My own work is around home care workers, so workers who go into the homes of elderly people to support them, you know, socially and health-wise, I'm going to rely on my colleagues at PSIRU, the Public Services International Research Unit, some of their work to reflect on public ownership and privatisation. So on the screen is a report that's just been done by Dave Hall, John Lister, and also We Own It on privatisation in the NH supply chain through COVID, and I'd recommend it to you. It's really good. I'm also going to draw on my colleague Jane Lethbridge's work, particularly the work she's done or she did before the last election, obviously in a different political context, but on the possibility of a national care service, so how we address the crisis in care, and also a bit on some of the stuff that Duncan Brown's done, talking about home care as well. So to start off with home care under COVID, obviously, we have seen a higher profile for care workers. Michael Marmot, Professor of Epidemiology, can't say that, at University College London, said the worst of the inequalities exposed by the pandemic is the skilled care workers who perform such a vital role. And we know that care workers, it's the highest number of deaths of any other occupation. So health and care workers have experienced the real sharp end of the crisis. And Alex Balin, who's an expert in corporate manslaughter, said that many of these deaths were avoidable with proper PPE. The failure to protect health and care workers is a disaster in its own right and is contributing to COVID-19's catastrophic death toll in this country. And the report that PSIRU have just done, that I just showed on the screen, concludes that the privatisation of health and social care has played a key role in this preventable catastrophe. So privatisation has created a system which is both chaotic and bureaucratic, both fragmented and sclerotic. There's been an outcry over PPE shortages in media coverage of the pandemic, but little has been said about privatisation, and this is a serious oversight. So if the privatisation of home care has seen the transfer of risk onto workers of employment rights, holiday pay, sick pay, pensions, etc., under COVID, we've seen the transfer of severe health and safety risk. So what's been highlighted is the issue of sick pay, the inability and reluctance of home care workers to take sick leave because they can't afford it, also because of their loyalty to their clients, the fact that councils are only paid for the care that's actually delivered, so they're not paid or supported for preventing workers from going to work in a crisis, in a pandemic, or for self-isolating. It's raised questions of who's responsible for PPE. Obviously, there's been some U-turns on COVID-19 bereavement, NHS surcharges. So are we seeing an opportunity to take advantage of the current wave of support to promote the rights of home care workers, but we also know that they're still excluded from the health visa system, and we'll see how that pans out. A new corona strategy for adult social care was belatedly published, but we know that there's still issues about the distribution of PPE and particularly access to testing for staff. Government has been given an emergency grant, but even before the crisis, Labour claimed that social care required an extra £8 billion of funding. So it's not taking us anywhere near to filling that funding gap. We have seen in the last decades a complete failure of the market. We now know that 95% of domiciliary care services have been privatised. I'm talking about the UK as a whole, and I know Scotland's different in terms of funding, but also hopefully aspiration. And I think that there's still a higher proportion of care in public sector in Scotland than in England. And I know Lillian will probably be able to help us with that in the discussion. But what's described as a funding crisis, Jane Lethbridge has said, actually, the major issue is the dependence on private provision. So private providers are answerable to demands from shareholders and investors before any democratic accountability to taxpayers. So because we know that the care sector is very labour intensive, the only way to cut costs is through cutting labour costs and reducing the quality of services. So the problems of social care funding is the result of this business model used by private care providers. And we know that private providers expect something like a 12% return on investment. And so the question, I think, is, should public authorities be contributing to this private return for shareholders? And could we see a limit on the rate of return to maybe 1 or 2%? Just quickly, we know that the overall state of funding has got worse. The paying conditions of care workers has got worse. Local authority spending is now 700 million below what it was in 2010 to 11. In the actual number of residential care beds has fallen. So, as I said, there's this big gap in what's needed to fund the system and what's actually funding it. And we also know that care providers themselves, so private providers themselves, aren't surviving. So even they cannot secure enough profit to keep going, and 400 care providers have gone bankrupt in the past 5 years. Many care providers, or private care providers, are now not bidding for contracts because they don't see them as cost effective anymore. Turning to home care workers in England, this is because the data we've got on contracts is for England and doesn't cover Scotland. So we know that over half of care workers in England are on 0 hours contracts. I think that the similar proportion for Scotland is only 11%, which seems quite low. I saw that in the Fair Work Convention report, but I'm not sure that they're the same, they're covering the same thing. So I would be surprised if it was that low, although I'm sure it's better than England. So most of them are paid the national living wage. That's become the benchmark for pay. Care workers 4 times more likely to be on 0 hours contracts than the rest of us, and extremely high turnover of staff in the field. So just the three things I want to just highlight in terms of home care workers' terms and conditions: the reliance on 0 hours contracts or guaranteed hours contracts, and that might be the difference in the figures for Scotland and England. We know with Unison's ethical care charter that there was pressure on authorities to end 0 hours contracts. I don't think that's necessarily been that successful. And what some of the providers did was to replace them with guaranteed hours contracts, which gave home care workers a few hours guaranteed work per week, but also meant that they could be flexed up and down as and when the providers wanted. So not necessarily the answer that we hoped it would be. We've also seen this requirement for the electronic monitoring of care. So when care workers go into people's homes, they log on through their own mobile phones or through the client's phone, and when they leave, they do the same. So the time they're in people's homes is recorded. And when these systems were introduced, they were seen as sort of maybe safeguarding workers, but have got wider implications. So the ability of providers to deliver contracts based upon local authority set charge rates actually depends on 0 hours contracts. You can't do it without; it's not economically viable. And we know that what 0 hours contracts do is that they mean there's no payment for travel time between visits. So when workers are travelling between visits, they're not paid. They're not paid for supervision or training, and they have this episodic working time. So if they've got visits with time in between, they often have to sit in a cafe waiting to go to the next visit, but are not paid for that. So once you average out their pay over the time they're available to the employer, it's far less than the national living wage. And the UK Home Care Association said a few years ago that actually it would not be possible for any London borough to pay a London living wage. It would just be too unrealistic on what councils are tendering contracts on. So I've got some quotes and I'll just have to quickly go through them, saying that we can't employ care staff on permanent contracts because we wouldn't be able to win those contracts. And there's this whole issue about when they were employed directly by local authorities, that they were working these peak times. So home care work is busy in the early morning, breakfast, lunchtime and evenings. And what are these workers doing in between? So how that working time is defined. So electronic monitoring introduced to locate workers, monitoring the real-time location of workers and when they're in clients' homes. Often also introduce a banding system where workers are paid to the nearest 15 minutes, but sometimes paid by the minute to the minute. And these have introduced cost savings for local authorities, because before that they were paying providers for commissioned hours, and now they just pay for the actual hours. So what you find with home care, which I'm sure people know, is that if a client goes into hospital, or if they decide they don't want to visit because their family's there or they're going out, they can turn the worker away, and that worker won't get paid, and the council won't get charged for that. So huge savings on the basis of paying only for the costs of actual care, and means that workers are unable to override the system because it's all electronic. So the time they sometimes used to get back, what they call clipping, so they could leave a visit slightly early in order to catch up on unpaid travel time, they can't do that anymore. And also they talked about, when we talked to home care workers, you can't stay and have a chat with your clients as you used to in the past. Everything's bang, 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 15-minute visits, everything is constrained. And they said, their employers said to them, if you want to have a chat with your clients, that's fine, but you have to log out and you're not going to be paid for it. So it's changed the nature of the relationship between home care workers and their clients. You're not going to get paid. And if someone has a fall, they reported that, if they have to stay late, because you can't leave someone if they've fallen over, you've got to stay with them, but it was quite clear that they weren't going to get paid for that time. So they regarded their working time as the length of time for which they wear their uniform, but only, hanging around between visits means that probably only half of their working time would qualify for pay. Some reported committing themselves to work 15-hour day, receiving only 5 to 8 hours pay. So I think the focus in the sector is on women's unpaid working time. So what 0 hours contracts and also combined with electronic monitoring has done is to remove what there's called so-called unproductive working time. So any time you're not in the client's home is considered to be unproductive. You don't need to be paid for that. And then if we finish on solutions, of course, you say, what can we do about this? But if you actually look into this history of home care, some of us can remember, well, I'm not going to say I can remember World War II, but home care started in World War II when women were paid informally a little bit of money to look after their neighbours. It then in the 1970s became a formal public sector job. So regular hours, employment security, access to pensions, latterly to equal pay, and to collective bargaining, to be covered by collective bargaining. And I've heard people say, well, why aren't home care workers unionised? Well, of course, they were unionised, highly unionised and covered by collective bargaining agreements. So the scaling back of state-funded support for care, the marketisation of welfare provision has meant the removal of home care jobs from the public sector and the exclusion of those workers from legal protections and collective representation. So some of the solutions that have been talked about into addressing the crisis in social care, some of the, can you move care workers from the national living wage onto the real living wage, advocated by the Living Wage Foundation, which would cost a lot of money. Obviously, we have to be very careful in that because employers continually manipulate hours through 0 hours contracts and the like. Another solution has been seen as the integration of health and social care and bringing care workers onto NHS Agenda for Change. So a much more formally evaluated pay system, which hopefully addresses equal pay. And finally, the other solution mentioned is to bring do to care workers what's been done for social workers, to professionalise it more, and hopefully evaluate the profession better. So Jane Lethbridge's report, which we can make available to people, concludes you have to have a much wider solution and recognise that the market is not an appropriate mechanism for organising social care. We need a publicly owned and publicly delivered national care service based on a care service free at the point of access and funded through taxation. And there's some debate about how much it should be controlled by local authorities and how much there should be a national framework. But Jane's view is that a publicly owned national care system which would be organised through local authorities providing strategic planning and delivery. So replacing the commissioning system with a local planning system, which then could offer private providers faced with a reduced rate of return maybe the option of public ownership through revised terms and conditions of service delivery, keeping existing home care workers on, transferring them back to local authority terms and conditions with opportunities for regrading, higher pay, retraining, and providing them with an incentive to stay in the sector. So the negotiation of the few larger care providers would be done by central government, but in regular communication with local authorities who would be specifically affected by any care service buyouts. And then the discussion can begin on how far you integrate health and social care beyond that. But there are examples of NHS and social care hubs which bring together health, social care, housing, voluntary and community organisations in a much more holistic manner. And finally, a system of training, of higher education, in partnership with local authorities to provide care workers with proper I don't like to individualise it on care workers, but to provide them with much more career progression and opportunities. So I'm going to leave it there, and I think Vera from PSIRU is just going to quickly talk about a few other bits of research we're doing in the same field. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Sian. Vera, I'm keen to hear from you as well. So, Vera, have you got a presentation for colleagues this evening, or are you just going to talk through some of the aspects that Sian's already identified?
I have a presentation as well. Let me just share it. Share my screen.
So again, colleagues, if you could keep your questions coming in, that's helpful.
Yeah, this is just really briefly like a shout out to go through some of the research what we have done. We thought that it would be interesting for people to hear, especially trade unionists on the panel, just of a bit of like the work we have done. So I'm really going to rush through some of the reports from this year. So the first one, which we hope is of interest for people here, is a toolkit, like a guide, which is coming out this July, so probably before the summer break. And in this toolkit, we specifically focused on how trade unionists can campaign for remunicipalization and what benefit this brings, not only for the workers, but also for citizens and service users and the environment. And one of the aspects which we covered are issues around transparency and democracy as well, democratic public services. So we looked at various sectors across the world, and because there's a huge research lack on how this has an impact on workers specifically, we did some primary research with 6 case studies where we looked at how public ownership or remunicipalization has an impact on workers. And yeah, some of the lessons are not so surprising when we have listened to Thomas and Sian before us. And the number one lesson is that you just don't privatize if you can avoid it, like campaign against it. And that a lot of campaigns have been successful either to stop privatization before it even occurs, or indeed to remunicipalize when trade unionists and civil society organizations and environmental groups worked together, so unite and fight. So this is really what we see. And another lesson we learned from all these different cases throughout the world is that it's very useful for trade unionists who often have, like workers have a lot of insights on how the services are run and understand this very well. And this knowledge can be used on the ground to do a proper cost benefit analysis. So it's important to have the broad brush on understanding the economic argument, like Thomas already outlined. You know, it is cheaper to have public services delivered in-house, owned and controlled, but more when it comes to the campaigning, it's really important to demonstrate this with a very clear cost benefit analysis to make it very easy to remunicipalize the service for the local authorities. And then another aspect I wanted to shout out is to, once a battle is won for remunicipalization or for public services in general, it doesn't mean that this battle will be won forever. Like, indeed, it's very important to not let the guard down, because we have seen cases where remunicipalized services were then reprivatized. Okay, another very quickly, another report we just finished, and which will be is now being translated and will come out in September, is commissioned by PSIRU, was on the circular economy and especially waste and water management. And we looked at, so the circular economy is this this belief that it's better to not just extract and make and dispose and to run our economy that way, but to really recycle, remake and share. And the problem with that is that it's a great concept, but the workers who are part of the recycling and the reusing are often are ignored, essentially. And it is still a very pro-growth capitalist model of running the economy where waste is good. So waste is a means of profit making. And what we see, what we concluded, or some of the conclusions in this report, were that it's really important to make the labor in the circular economy visible. We have seen this now with the whole the whole discourse on key workers and essential workers. And this is again highlighted when we look at the waste sector. We see that in the current Green New Deals and EU's circular economy policies, the health and safety of workers is completely ignored. And we also see that this profit-making model of waste as a profit, and it's actually incentive to have more and more waste. So the circular economy is at odds with waste prevention, and obviously waste prevention would be far better for the environment. And however, where we see really good examples of a functioning circular economy model in line with also reducing waste or preventing waste, and we see that these systems are holistic because they are run by the public, and only a public, like a waste management system which is publicly owned and controlled, this holistic approach makes it possible. I want to rush through these reports. So yeah, and this is what the report Sian already outlined earlier. This is a report just recently published and done by Dave Hall and colleagues. And it really looked into the aspect that there have been many deaths of healthcare workers and care workers, like Sian outlined. And while often it has been, the lack of PPE has been emphasized, what the real issue is the privatization, where we see that the system just did not deliver for the people who are delivering these essential services. So one of the lessons learned is that privatization has created a system which is very chaotic, very bureaucratic, and therefore really not easy to use when there is a crisis at place, like even the coordination of it. It has not been democratic. There has been a huge lack of transparency. Yes, in the UK there is, so this report is only focusing in the UK, and we can see that yes, there is a National Health Service, and that's great, but the problem is that the NHS is completely underfunded in this outsourcing and giving away the responsibility. Like I already said, it created a very chaotic, very inflated system where it's for profit and not for the service. And it also really incentivizes corruptions. And this is what we again and again see, and also specifically highlighted in this report. And then the last and final one I wanted to shout out is a report which we're currently doing. So this is really work in progress. It's estimated to come out in September, so probably it's realistic that it will be October. But this is, I think, a very interesting one where we look at lessons throughout the world and from different countries, and see how different countries responded to the pandemic. And both in terms of healthcare, but also in terms of the economic recession, which is basically following now. So, and we do a mixed methods approach here of quantitative modeling and case studies. And just very briefly, to just preliminary findings we have so far is, but it's probably not very surprising for many of you on the panel, is that yes, it helps if we have the crisis responses in some countries we have seen, like go hard and go early into lockdown, like the New Zealand slogan, where we see that this has worked very well. We also see the countries where which have suffered from past pandemics have done really well or better in responding to the crisis. And of course, we also see that less connected countries are less affected, and island states are also doing better. But beyond that, we really see across the globe that where there has been a good public healthcare system with universal access, this is what really matters, and this is like the resilience Thomas already talked about. So we see this everywhere, and this again strengthens, I think this pandemic really strengthens our call for public ownership. But in the same time, we also see the opposite happening. We see that there's crisis capitalism happening, that it's often the same as usual. Like there is a crisis, so let's just outsource the problem and give away the responsibility. So we see very fast-paced outsourcing, where again, we see the profits are privatized and the loss is socialized. And we also see that the pandemic has exacerbated pre-existing economic and social inequalities. It's across the globe. We see that areas with weaker economies have been hit harder and will be hit harder by the recession which is following. But also we really see that marginalized groups have hit the hardest. And we've seen this with BAME workers, but we also have this seen, especially in terms of migration and the outbreaks in now meat factories, but also food picking. And we see that migrant workers have been really, really hard hit, which again shows us that the people who are key for our economy are disregarded the most. Another response is that on the one hand, we see Green New Deal policies, where we see like the rise of electronic vehicles, we see the encouragement of cycling, but on the other hand, we also see this Green New Deal, like now basically, where we see that, for example, healthcare is more and more delivered on screens, education more and more delivered on screens, the very fast digitalization of public services, and this is something we really need to watch out for when it goes in line with profit making. That was so quick. I hope it was just basically a little bit of advertisement and what's going on here. I'm very available for any further questions, so just contact me by email afterwards or now in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. That was really interesting. I know that you're rushed through that presentation, but really interesting. I wish we could have spent more time through the presentation, but I'm sure we'll get a number of questions that hopefully you'll be able to respond to. Can I introduce our final speaker, Mathew Lawrence? Mathew, do you want to do your presentation? Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks, everyone. So I'm Mathew Lawrence, Director of Commonwealth, not Commonweal, which I'm sure you'll all be very familiar with Commonweal, which we do a lot of work with, but we are UK focused and beyond, working with partners including Thomas Hanna and the Democracy Collaborative in the US. But our core focus is on ownership models as a mechanism to transform the economy. What I wanted to focus on briefly in the next 5 minutes or so was a sort of new area of debate really around public ownership, which is digital infrastructure and data. And I think it's obviously a very timely time to be talking about this, as COVID has really underscored, if it wasn't already obvious, how important digital connection, how important digital infrastructure is to being able to quite literally connect, but whether it's work, whether it's family life, whether it's play in lockdown, it's fundamental. And what I want to do is briefly run through the arguments behind a paper, which I'll sort of share in a moment on the sort of chat once I'm done, that Thomas Hanna, myself, Miriam Brett, and Adrian Buller published earlier this year, looking at what would be a sort of democratically owned digital infrastructure for the UK. But I'll try and bring in some Scotland-specific elements. And in their report, we made a sort of fundamental argument that what we need to try and do in terms of public policy and a politics of digital infrastructure is move from a very sort of narrow, sort of financialized model of provision towards treating digital connectivity as a human right and decommodifying connection, and organizing digital infrastructure, in particular the full fiber network that generates sort of super fast connection, as a vital 21st century public good, and that needs to be underpinned by democratic public ownership and governance, with workers and communities having a real stake in how it's rolled out. And that might seem sort of a break from tradition or sort of slightly unusual, given the relatively sort of, the normal sectors that public ownership debates typically cover. But we'd argue that actually, if you look at the history of democratic public ownership models, it actually makes complete sense to extend it into these new frontiers of digital infrastructure. So in the 20th century, you saw, the sort of fundamental technologies and infrastructures of electricity, of road networks, of, railways being built and publicly owned by public institutions. And if you look at telecommunications in particular, you'll see it's actually common sense in a way to extend public ownership to things like full fiber. So you'll see that Gladstone nationalised the telegraph system, and Asquith, going back a bit here, nationalised the sort of the emerging telephone industry. And that was because of a simple sort of insight, which is that the market and for-profit maximising institutions will fail to deliver a universal telecommunications network. They'll underprovide in poorer areas, in hard-to-reach areas, in less profitable areas. So what's the status quo right now? Well, there are some devolved powers to Holyrood, but in general, it's kind of, a lot of this is reserved powers in terms of the regulation of the digital market. But the basic premise, both of the UK government, but to a large extent the Scottish government as well, the premise for rolling out full fibre in the UK is to encourage competition and the entry of new market actors into the market, into a for-profit market, to roll out full fibre, and then to subsidise corporate actors to connect hard to reach areas. And obviously with the Highlands and Islands, some of the hardest to reach areas in all of Europe in some ways for digital connectivity, that's particularly relevant. But the problem with this is, first of all, it fails, underserves, underprovides, it's expensive, it's highly financialized, and it leads to a digital landscape which is marked by exclusion, which is marked by a lack of provision. So the UK comes 35th out of 37 OECD countries for the breadth and scale of its coverage. Only 13% of households have full fibre connection, and almost half of households in the UK receive their internet from 20th century, sort of mid-20th century, sort of copper-based digital technologies. So how do we go from that position to a position of universal network? So our argument is, and this is in some ways based on the UK government's own analysis, is that if you look at it, it's cheaper, faster, and fairer to do it through a public monopoly provider. So the government's own analysis suggests that to deliver 100% full fibre network across the UK, which has huge economic, social, and environmental benefits, to deliver that network, it costs roughly £32 billion of capital expenditure to do it through private competition, private actors, people like Virgin Media, Openreach, and others. To do it through a single monopoly provider, it would be £20 billion. And not only is it sort of £12 billion sort of cheaper, it also would do it faster and do it more universally because it's planned, because it's coordinated, because it's coherent. So our argument is that a public infrastructure company with sort of regional arms in the UK and then a sort of Scottish arm, potentially sort of Highlands and Islands because of the sort of specific geography, but then sort of Central Belt and sort of Lowlands as a sort of other modular elements, should be tasked with investing to roll out this £20 billion capex, planning the rolling out of full fibre so we can get to a fully universal full fibre network by 2030. And once we build that network, which would be a great sort of jobs creator in sort of COVID economic crisis, once we build that network, once you control publicly the underlying infrastructure, you can do really interesting things, like you can sort of essentially decommodify, make the internet free once you sort of pay for the OPEX, which you can cover through general taxation. So our argument, which will be in this report, and again, a bit of a whiz through like everyone else, but is that actually if we want to roll out 100% full fibre network, then we need public ownership and public investment to deliver that if we would want to deliver it as fast, as affordably, and as fairly as possible. So I'll stop there because I'm aware of the time.
Colleagues, thanks very much for all of those presentations, and thank you for trying to keep to the time. I know we said we would offer 30 minutes for the Q&A. We are slightly behind. We had some technical problems at the beginning, as you know, but we are slightly behind. But I'm keen to offer up the questions and have some discussion around the questions that we've got. So you'll see, colleagues, in the chat that those that have asked questions. Thank you for that. The first question we've got for yourself, Thomas, is around the form or the organisational form in terms of the enterprises that they've adopted. In particular, there's a question around cooperatives. So maybe you could expand on some of the work that you're doing in that space to answer that question in particular.
Sure, yes. So my organization has traditionally done quite a lot of work with cooperatives. We helped set up the Evergreen network of cooperatives in Cleveland, Ohio, which is a linked network of 3 cooperatives in a very disinvested and disenfranchised part of the city, loosely modeled on the Mondragon cooperative network in the Basque region of Spain. As I said in my presentation, I focus mostly on public ownership, and what I mean by public ownership is enterprises that are not cooperatives. They are enterprises that are owned by all people, usually through state vehicles, government at local levels. And what I'm particularly interested in is taking some of the lessons and some of the internal structures and governance models from things like cooperatives, from enterprises that are more democratized, and then applying them to traditional publicly owned enterprises and seeing if we can come up with a new model of sort of democratically owned or democratically governed public enterprises.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Thomas. There's a number of questions being posted around social care. So I'm going to look to Vera and Sian to respond to some of these. Sian, in your presentation, you highlighted some of the challenges and difficulties within the system, within the care sector within England in particular, and perhaps wondered if we were doing something different in Scotland. I have to say that we are not immune to some of those precarious contracts of employment that you described. We're not immune to some of the challenges that England are faced with around 0 hours contracts. What we have done, and hopefully you've had sight of it, we've done some work through the Fair Work Convention, and you mentioned that in your presentation, the inquiry that we launched from the convention, the Fair Work Convention, into social care. And the recommendations from that have been given support from Scottish Government with respect of the body that's been established to look at those recommendations. The Fair Work and Care Group has ministerial support, and hopefully those recommendations will flow in. The significant recommendation around that was a review of the commissioning and procurement process, along with the removal of an appropriate 0 hours contract and a standard contract being written for care workers, making sure that they were in line with their Fair Work principles. So we are doing some things differently, but our level of privatisation within the care sector is huge. Over 60% is still privatised, so a lot of work that we need to do. Some of the questions that have been asked from colleagues around the care sector from Emma Phillips is around how do we then use what we know is to be the right thing to do in terms of public ownership around the national care sector. How do we use, or what arguments to be used to influence Scottish Government, and what wider arguments, what wider influence should we have around our campaigning work? So something specific around Scottish Government in terms of influence in their direction, but more widely around the general campaigning work. And you picked up some of the significant issues around PPE that health workers and social care workers were faced with, yet those were getting lots of traction in the media, nothing around the providers who failed to provide that PPE, which I think is hugely important. So a couple of things in there for you, Sian, if you don't mind.
I think COVID does obviously offer some possibilities to raise the issue about home care, and particularly that an underfunded service is a danger to public health. And if we're thinking about a second wave, we need to do something now. Those workers, those home care workers, are in the front line. They're in an incredibly dangerous situation, and yet their working conditions are horrendous. Their pay is horrendous, and they cannot provide any quality of service. So it's raising the quality of service, but at the same time, the conditions of the workers. And again, there's some of these issues about why are these private providers expecting this level of profit from public contracts? You know, even though they are, they're still not making sufficient profit for themselves and going out of business. So it's an incredibly precarious system. And at the end of the day, you know, the transaction costs of commissioning, putting things out to tender, making everything about compliance rather than the quality of care. So I think there's a number of issues, but I think it's really important to emphasise that the whole system rests on the unpaid labour of women, and you know, not to be shy about raising that their labour is not being valued sufficiently.
No, I think that's hugely important, and something that we recognised again in the Fair Work report around social care. Majority of the workforce, over 80%, being low-paid, part-time female workers working in those precarious contracts of employment, a real gender issue. And one of the questions that were asked earlier is around, do we have some of those statistical information around gender and race? And if we do have that, how then do we get that out into the wider community so people understand the challenges?
Yeah, I mean, the figures are there. As I said, there's the data collection is different from England and Scotland, and you just said it's 83% women in Scotland, it's very similar, I think, throughout England, and very high proportion of BAME workers. So I think in London, 2/3 of home care workers are from Black and other ethnic minorities. And also in The Guardian yesterday, there's an article saying that, you know, if home care workers aren't allowed visas, then the system again is going to collapse in certain places because it's dependent on migrant workers.
No, absolutely. There's a question in the chat, and I suppose I'm going to pose this question to all the panelists, and it's around the tactics that we should use as trade unionists in order to bring about public ownership. So what tactics would you think would be most beneficial for us as trade unionists on the ground to use in Scotland to bring about that public ownership? Who wants to go first?
I can say a few things about it. I mean, I just also typed in the chat that this is exactly there's so many things to say about it, obviously, and we have very little time, but this is exactly one of the key questions we address in the remunicipalization guide, which will come out like, you know, this July. So I just want to signpost that. But I think a very key thing to remember is when we campaign is that we are stronger if we are bigger. So really to you know, think creatively about the allies we have in society, and sometimes this can be environmental groups, civil society groups, feminist groups, you know, for issues like what Sian just outlined. So really to you know, widen the coalition. Really, we see that where this has been done, this was very, very successful. And on the other hand, we also see that where this did not happen, where trade unions campaigned on their own or were sidelined by civil society groups, that the campaigns for remunicipalization were much harder. It was much harder to win them, or almost were lost, or in times were even lost. That's one aspect I want to highlight. And the second aspect is really, you know, thinking about the event we're in, and like democratic public ownership, and why does it matter? It matters because one key aspect of privatization is the lack of transparency. And this is, you know, profit making in secret, really. And we see that campaigns for not actually public ownership, but for just transparency around the issue of privatization have essentially led to public ownership, and to really push that we are entitled to know what's going on and who is profiting from our public services and who is not benefiting. So these are the two things I just want to highlight, but there's so much more to say.
Thanks, Vera. Anyone else want to contribute? Matthew?
Yeah, I mean, maybe one would just be, I think one of the challenges, even though of course it's, you know, public ownership is very successful, you know, in a whole range of places where it's practiced. I think one of the challenges it faces here is that people don't really believe it, they're skeptical of it, they think, oh, does this work? I think Scotland's quite lucky in that, you know, in things like the Scottish National Investment Bank and a sort of series of other areas, there are, I guess, some institutions emerging which, with like organised pressure, you could see these institutions bending the curve a little bit, being real allies in bolstering sort of public ownership of assets, institutions, you know, a whole series of areas. So I guess partly would just be like, you know, trade unions organising around sort of specific institutions to showcase how they're working, how they're sort of setting, you know, Scotland on a different trajectory, and how that's, you know, making a real difference to their members, sort of, you know, workplaces and communities, and are using the existing institutions to then build out from there, would be my sort of sense of it potentially, and also definitely what Vera said too.
No, thank you for that. Any other colleagues, Thomas or Sian, do you want to add to that, Thomas?
Yeah, I'll try and answer that and weave together some of the other questions in the chat. But I think that trade unionists need to, or should, not only be defensive of public ownership. We definitely need to be defensive of public ownership, but we need to be advancing more innovative models and concepts and democratic processes. And there's this question of like, well, workers in public enterprises sometimes have not, you know, or conditions have been similar to private enterprises. And I think that's very much true. You know, there's definitely formal and informal processes by which we can empower workers within public enterprises. And some of the formal processes are like, you know, workers on boards, work councils, different sort of, you know, trying to agitate for these more formal methods for participation within public enterprises. And then informally, we need to very much be organizing around the experiences of frontline workers and making sure that the experiences of frontline workers inform the direction and governance and management of enterprises. And I think those are all things that trade unionists can sort of gravitate towards and organize around. And that will also present a vision of public ownership that isn't just backwards looking. It's not just traditional, it's forwards looking, it's for the 21st century. It's something that people, both in the trade union movement, but also in the general public, can see as being new and innovative and future looking.
Thanks, Thomas. Sian, did you want to add to that?
Just to reinforce what people said, that we have to be very brave about asserting that public ownership is the only way forward if we're going to protect services for vulnerable people, to have universal services, and not to shy behind that. Unfortunately, the debate's opened up in the past few years in a way that it hadn't before. And I think, despite, you know, a lot of us feeling very demoralised about the fact that we could have had a radical Labour government who would have taken, you know, us forward on this, that, you know, we have to keep the level of debate up and not back down on it.
No, I think those are fantastic points. One of the other questions that we've got this evening from one of the participants is around, well, basically asking as if the days of reforming the capitalist systems are gone, and we should look at, before we go in, as we are in a crisis at the minute, before we swimming in debt, as the colleague says, looking at the massive inequalities that we have and those that are opening up in chasm form as a consequence of COVID. Should we be looking past the reforms towards a fundamental structural change, and how do trade unions demand that within a public sector environment? So again, it's much the same as, similar to the last question about what should we use to advance the cause, what trade unions should use in that space. But I think really, should we be changing the narrative around tinkering around the edges and going full bang for a complete and utter complete change? And I say that and coming from your presentation, Sian, around social care and looking at a national care system. I think through COVID, the spotlight has absolutely shone on the provision of social care, the provision of home care and within care homes, and the challenges that has brought for the workers in that environment, but more so for the clients and patients who were living in that space. So a lot of work for us to do, I think, in that space. I do think we need to change the narrative rather than saying we want to change or tinker around the edge, to a complete radical fundamental review of the provision of services publicly owned, through public service first, but also publicly driven. So I don't know if folks want to answer any of the questions that you've got on the chat. You can see what people are asking. If there's anything else that you want to add to that, we've only got a minute or two left before we need to close this evening's discussion. So if you want to make any closing remarks or pick up any of those points, please do. Thomas?
Yeah, just very briefly, I 100% believe that in this question that capitalism is reaching its limits. I believe it's not just the COVID crisis, it's a longer term process that we've reached. And I think we're really at an inflection point. And you know, there are multiple paths opening up in front of us in terms of ways that things could go. And a lot of them are really not good. You know, there are some very bad options in front of us as a society. And so I think we really need to double down now. Now is the time. And that goes for public ownership as well. You know, as I said, public ownership is a very flexible ownership form. It can be very much sort of taken and appropriated by the right. It can be used for their purposes, for state capitalist purposes. It can be used for populist, you know, really xenophobic and racist purposes. So we really need to be very careful, and we really need to be very active in this moment. It's a very dangerous moment.
Okay, thank you. Any
I just
other
wanted to
points?
add, also, I think we need to be really thinking about the reorganisation of work. I mean, we're obviously going to be faced with mass unemployment, and it links with everything on, you know, the Green New Deal, how we enter into new environmentally sustainable just transition. But we really, I think, need to be talking about a 3-day, 4-day week, which involves the renegotiation of care relationships. So, you know, that people will, you know, change how they care, change how they work, change the type of work they do. They might do a mix of work. I mean, I think, we do have to think about this total thing about the working week as well.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Colleagues, I'm going to close now, but before I do that, I want to draw your attention to next week's webinar. But before I do that, also I want to thank the panellists and apologise to Mathew for introducing my introduction at Commonwealth, not Commonweal. So thank you for drawing that to our attention, and apologies again for that.
Right.
But huge thank you, colleagues, for your contributions. Apologies that we had to rush you through that. We could have, I genuinely could have spent a whole evening around this, having debate and discussion with you on the merits of all of this. Very close to my heart is health and care, social care. So let's keep in touch and see what we can do to keep this agenda item on the move, and to launch our national care service is what I think we're all looking for, to rid ourselves of privatisation and profit and greed. So thank you very much for your contributions this evening. And I just draw folks' attention to next week's webinar, Paying for the Coronavirus, which will look at the economic policies that we need to ensure that the rich pay and not the working class pay for the fallout of coronavirus. We've got a fantastic lineup yet again for next week's webinar, which includes the Tribune writer Grace Berkeley, Laurie McFarlane from UCU, and Christine Cooper from the University of Edinburgh. You can register again for the webinar, the upcoming webinar, on the STUC website, which is www.stuc.org.uk, and we will be advertising this on our Facebook and Twitter feeds. So again, for colleagues that participated, thank you, and for those that joined us, keep that hashtag going. Let's go viral. Let's get this out. Let's let people know that that the STUC and their like-minded folk are doing some really valuable work in this space. So